Every few weeks, a new headline appears on the internet claiming that the world is tired of Americans too loud, too rich, too political, too opinionated. According to the way the media tells it, it feels like the entire world has collectively shut the door, turned off the porch light, and put up an invisible sign that reads, "Not welcome." Especially Americans. But there's a small detail that very few people are willing to look at honestly. While social media argues endlessly, protests flash across screens, and politicians keep talking into cameras, visas are still being approved, homes are still being bought, and American retirement checks are still flowing steadily into foreign bank accounts as if nothing has really changed. Because there is an uncomfortable truth here. Many countries do not need Americans because they love America, nor because they admire American culture or politics. They need Americans because their systems have very real, very specific, and increasingly urgent gaps. Populations are aging faster than children are being born. Labor shortages are growing across entire industries. Public budgets depend on predictable revenue. And steady income streams, pensions, savings, long-term consumer spending don't disappear just because of a media panic or an election cycle. So this is not a story about emotions. It's not about who likes whom or who hates whom. And it's not an escape fantasy from the United States. This is a story about demographics, economics, and the cold practicality of countries trying to keep their systems functioning. Americans are not welcomed because they are loved. They are accepted because they fill the gaps the system leaves behind. And today, we're talking about the places where that reality still holds true. 7. Japan. Japan often exists in the foreign imagination as a closed society, difficult to integrate into a place where you can live for decades and still feel like you're standing on the outside. A country of strict rules, restrained emotions, and very little interest in outsiders, especially Americans, too loud, too free, too different from the order Japan has carefully maintained for centuries. But that's only the surface. And Japan, more than most countries, cannot be understood from the surface alone. Beneath the silence and discipline lies a system under growing strain. Japan's population is aging at a pace few developed nations can keep up with. Schools in rural areas are closing because there are no children left to fill them. Villages that were once alive are now populated almost entirely by the elderly, living in aging homes, waiting for children and grandchildren who moved to the cities or overseas years ago. Labor shortages are no longer a future concern, they are a daily reality. And with fewer workers comes a shrinking tax base. In this context, Japan hasn't suddenly become open. It hasn't changed its identity. It hasn't rebranded itself as an immigrant paradise. Instead, it has begun to quietly adjust. Expanding residency pathways for foreign workers, skilled professionals, and retirees, people who can support themselves without placing stress on the system. This is where Americans enter the picture not as a cultural symbol, but as a practical economic equation. Retired Americans bring predictable pension income. Their money doesn't depend on the local job market. They spend consistently, use healthcare services, rent homes, buy food, and pay taxes. More importantly, they don't arrive with the goal of changing Japan. They arrive prepared to live within it. Japan doesn't ask you to belong in an emotional sense. You don't have to become Japanese. You only need to respect the rules, maintain order, and avoid turning your presence into a disruption. No noise, no demands, no attempts to bend the system to fit old habits. And this is the unspoken condition very few people state clearly. Japan doesn't want you to belong. It wants you to fit in quietly. If you can do that, Japan won't just tolerate you, it will let you stay. And in a society that values stability above all else, that quiet permission speaks louder than any welcome sign ever could. 6. Greece. In many people's minds, Greece is a country past its golden age, a place defined by debt crises, austerity street protests, and now tourism so overwhelming that ancient cities sometimes feel more like airports than places to live. The media often frames Greece as a fragile economy surviving on summer seasons and sunset photos made for Instagram. But that story is for visitors, not for people who stay. Beneath the tourist surface lies a very different reality. Greece is aging. Young people spent years leaving during the crisis, chasing jobs in Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, anywhere with clearer prospects. Villages have grown quieter. Schools have fewer students. Small businesses struggle to find successors. And the economy doesn't actually need more 3-day visitors. It needs people who stay long enough for everyday life to function. Greece doesn't lack arrivals. It lacks residents. And this is where Americans begin to make quiet sense. Retired Americans arrive with predictable pension income. Their money doesn't rise and fall with tourist seasons. They spend steadily all year long, rent groceries, healthcare, neighborhood cafes. They pay taxes. Nothing flashy, nothing disruptive, but enough to keep the local economy moving when summer ends. Greece understands this very well. That's why residency programs tied to income, property, and retirement haven't disappeared. They've become clearer and more practical. The government doesn't shout about it. It doesn't market aggressively. But the message is unmistakable. If you can support yourself, there is room for you here. Still, Greece has its own unspoken condition. It isn't looking for people who live as if they're on a permanent vacation. It needs people who can accept a slower rhythm, sometimes so slow it borders on boredom. A Tuesday afternoon with nothing planned, no events, no urgency, no sense that you're missing out. And that is the real test. They want people who can afford to be bored on a Tuesday. If you need constant stimulation, speed, and momentum, Greece will make you restless. But if you can sit a little longer at a cafe, recognize the baker by name, and treat quiet as a form of wealth, Greece won't just accept you, it will quietly keep you. Not because it needs you to love the country, but because it needs people patient enough to live with it. 5. Thailand. Thailand is often seen as unpredictable. Visas change frequently. Rules can be unclear. What's correct today might be revised tomorrow. For people used to rigid systems and clear guarantees, Thailand gets labeled as unstable, even unreliable. And in some ways, that reputation isn't wrong. But the mistake is assuming Thailand was ever designed to offer total control. It wasn't. Thailand is built to flow. And beneath that apparent instability is something very consistent, an economy that depends heavily on people who stay long-term. Expats, retirees, foreigners who live slowly, spend steadily, use healthcare, rent homes, eat out daily, and don't leave after 2 weeks. Private healthcare services, real estate, restaurants, entire coastal towns and inland cities, many parts of Thailand's economy quietly run on this money. No official announcements, no grand speeches, just reality. Then there's daily life, something you can't understand by reading visa rules on a website. Americans don't really move to Thailand. They exhale there. They arrive carrying spreadsheets, cholesterol test results, and a low-grade anxiety about the future. Somewhere between the airport and their first bowl of noodles, their shoulders drop. Time loosens. And the numbers start to make sense. Coffee costs less than a parking meter. A good meal costs what a minor fee used to back home. Healthcare doesn't require hesitation before booking an appointment. And then something dangerous happens to old assumptions. The math suddenly works. Pensions stretch further. Savings stop evaporating every month. The fear of outliving your money shrinks into a small inconvenience, like forgetting sunscreen. Thailand doesn't rush you. It doesn't push you away from the table. It doesn't shame you for sitting too long without ordering more. Life here isn't a productivity contest. It's more like a long lunch where no one brings the bill too early. But Thailand also has its unspoken conditions. You can't expect consistency. You can't demand control. Visas may change, rules may shift, and the same flexibility that makes life feel easier can also make people uncomfortable. The message is clear even if it's never stated directly. Thailand welcomes you as long as you don't expect consistency or control. If you need rigid systems to feel safe, Thailand will stress you out. But if you're willing to trade some certainty for lower costs, a slower rhythm, and the feeling that life has stopped charging interest on itself, many people come here and quietly decide not to leave. 4. Panama. Panama doesn't try to hide its intentions. To many people, it looks like an aggressively marketed tax haven, glossy brochures, bold promises, and messaging that sometimes feels closer to a late-night infomercial than a serious life plan. To some Americans, Panama can seem like a place trying a little too hard to sell the dream. But the truth is, Panama has never pretended to be anything else. Beneath the marketing is a system that is remarkably honest about what it needs. Panama needs money circulating through its economy. It needs retirees who stay long-term. It needs expats who remain long enough to rent homes, use services, visit doctors, eat lunch every day, and participate in the economy the way it was designed to function. Not weekend tourists, not people passing through, but people who stay. And Panama isn't shy about saying so. There's no pretense, no attempt to hide behind vague ideals. From visa policies and retiree incentives to a territorial tax system, everything points back to a simple idea: if your income comes from elsewhere and you spend it here, Panama is happy to have you. The real appeal of Panama isn't found in slogans. It's in everyday details. A dollarized economy means you don't have to constantly recalibrate prices in your head. Territorial taxation means foreign income isn't aggressively scrutinized. Healthcare is reasonable, good enough to trust, clear enough not to feel like a trap. Life in Panama doesn't feel like being on a permanent vacation. It feels like a series of normal days, just lighter. You go out without calculating every expense. Lunch costs what lunch should cost, not what a pricing strategy decided. Mornings pass without urgency. And eventually, you realize you've stopped doing mental math every time you leave the house. It's a small thing, but for many people it feels like freedom. Of course, Panama isn't perfect. It's hot and humid. Paperwork can be frustrating. The system is human, slow, flexible, and not always by the book. But that's also what makes it feel real. And this is the unspoken condition Panama sets without ever needing to say it out loud. Panama doesn't sell paradise. It sells normal days that feel affordable. If you're searching for perfection, Panama will disappoint you. But if you're looking for a life where everyday expenses don't feel like a constant scam, Panama doesn't need to convince you. It just needs you to stay long enough to notice. 3. Spain. In recent years, Spain has often appeared in headlines filled with complaints. Digital nomads, rising rents, locals feeling pushed out of their own neighborhoods. From the outside, it can look like Spain is growing tired of foreigners, especially those who arrive with laptops, take away coffee, and treat every bar as a temporary office. But as with many places, the real picture sits beneath those frustrations. The truth is that Spain is dealing with deep structural challenges, one of the lowest birth rates in Europe, a generation of young people who are educated but unemployed or underemployed, small towns and rural areas steadily emptying out, and an economy that needs more than short-term visitors. It needs stable, long-term income coming from outside its borders. That's why, despite the complaints, Spain continues to issue visas for retirees, remote workers, and people with predictable income. Not because the country is unaware of the tension, but because it understands the math behind it. External income helps stabilize the system, supports public services, and keeps everyday life functioning in places that no longer have enough internal momentum. Spanish attitudes toward Americans are also more nuanced than headlines suggest. People follow global politics. They know what's happening in the United States. But most don't confuse governments with individuals. Political frustration doesn't automatically get projected onto the person sitting across the table at lunch. Still, Spain has a very clear boundary. It doesn't want daily life turned into a product. Cafes are places to talk, eat, and linger, not 8-hour workspaces filled with video calls and charging cables. The rhythm of life here matters, and it isn't something meant to be optimized. That's the unspoken condition you need to understand before arriving. Don't turn every cafe into a co-working space. If you can respect that rhythm, respect local life, and arrive as someone who stays rather than someone who occupies Spain, isn't closing its doors. It's simply reminding newcomers that being welcomed doesn't mean being allowed to reshape everything to fit their habits. 2. Italy. Italy is often seen as beautiful but exhausted, bureaucratic, slow, outdated. Paperwork feels endless, timelines stretch far beyond expectations, and there's a sense that the country is running on the momentum of its past. To outsiders, Italy can feel like a living museum, stunning to visit, but difficult to truly live in. But that perspective comes from major cities and tourist seasons. Step away from the familiar destinations, and you'll find a very different Italy. Villages growing emptier each year, shutters closed all day, abandoned stone homes with cracked walls, schools short on students merging classes or shutting down entirely. Not because Italy has lost its appeal, but because young people left long ago chasing jobs, speed, and futures that felt more predictable elsewhere. Italy's problem isn't a lack of visitors, it's a lack of people who stay. This is where Americans quietly matter. They don't arrive to film content or build personal brands. They come to buy the houses no one else wants. Invest real money restoring them and bring lights back on in the evenings. They pay taxes. They shop locally. They sit in cafes long enough to become familiar faces. In this picture, Americans aren't changing Italy. They're helping keep it from disappearing. Local governments understand this. Mayors of small towns understand it. Programs offering symbolic home prices, tax incentives, and long-stay visas aren't gimmicks. They're attempts to refill empty chairs, not to rebrand the country, but to keep communities functioning. Italy also has its unspoken condition. It doesn't need influencers. It doesn't need people passing through. It doesn't need towns turned into photo backdrops. Italy doesn't need influencers. It needs people who stay. If you can accept the slowness, respect the rhythm, and understand that the real value here isn't speed, but continuity, Italy won't promise miracles, but it will do something more meaningful. It will allow you to become part of the place quietly and over time. 1. Mexico. Mexico is often associated with words that make people hesitate: crime, instability, risk. In the news, it appears as a country permanently on edge, a place where you're expected to stay alert and never fully relax. For many Americans, Mexico feels too close to be worth the risk, even though they continue to visit it regularly for short vacations. But that's the view from the outside and from a safe distance. The reality is that Americans have been living in Mexico for decades, not as a sudden trend, not as a viral movement, but quietly, steadily, community by community. Money flows across the border in predictable ways. Pensions, savings, remote income. Neighborhoods stay occupied year-round. Doctors stay because they have patients. Shops stay open because they have regular customers. The local economy doesn't explode, it functions. From Mexico's perspective, that matters. Americans don't just bring money, they bring continuity. They rent long-term. They fix roofs instead of flipping houses. They return to the same restaurants, the same markets, the same doctors. Over time, they become part of the daily scenery rather than a disruptive force. Mexico earns the #1 spot for very practical reasons. It's close to the United States. It shares time zones. Flights are short. When you need to go back, it's easy. When you want to stay, you don't have to cut the cord completely. The relationship doesn't demand a clean break. It allows people to loosen the tie instead. But Mexico also has clear boundaries. Very clear, even if they're rarely stated out loud. You're accepted if you adapt. If you learn the rhythm. If you shop locally, accept differences, and resist the urge to turn everything into a replica of where you came from. The unspoken message is simple. Americans who adapt are tolerated. Those who try to redesign things are not. If you come to Mexico trying to escape, you'll never fully relax. But if you come to live with respect, patience, and an understanding that you're a guest in a system that existed long before you, Mexico doesn't promise paradise. It offers something more practical, a life that's sustainable, close enough to home to feel connected, and different enough to make things meaningful again. No country on this list loves Americans in an emotional way. They don't love the politics, the noise, or the endless online arguments. What they value is stability, predictable income, and people who create minimal disruption to their systems. The doors were never truly closed. They've simply become smaller, quieter, and reserved for those who understand the rules. The world hasn't turned its back on Americans, it's just stopped saying, "Welcome" out loud. If you can offer stability and keep your expectations realistic, the door is still there, it's just quieter. If you found this video useful, subscribe for more, and leave a comment below which country surprised you the most.